writing, blogging, podcasting, different types of storytelling with Joey Ayoub, co-founder of the Hummus for Thought podcast, for this episode of the Beirut Banyan.
Not the capital that has really seen as much momentum, if you want, or at least in a sustained level, as Tripoli or Nabatea. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that the protests in Beirut haven't been significant. Obviously, they have been. But in Tripoli and in Nabatea, we've seen a kind of a very conscious opposition to sectarianism, because those are two regions that have obviously been especially affected by sectarianism. Not that the rest of the country hasn't been either. So that's all I meant, is that there is a decentralization that's taking place, and that has allowed, I think, protesters to feel that this time it's really different. This time we are all in this together.
And I'm assuming that you've been in Beirut since the uprising began.
Yes, I went there the first day. So it started on the night of October 17th, and I was down the morning of the 18th.
Okay, so that would have been Friday morning, just really hours after this began.
Yes, I was there at something like 7 or 8 a.m.
Okay, and I'm curious, now that we're in day 28 and we're watching events unfold on TV, there's suddenly protests reaching Baabda Palace. Does the momentum feel the same now as it did on day 1 or day 2?
Yes, it does. The momentum is always very difficult to judge. Like, it's very difficult to say, well, today is better than yesterday, or today is worse than last week, or anything like that. It's always different. And I think a very strong argument as to why this feels different is precisely that. It's the fact that protesters are coming up with very different ways of making their voices heard on a quasi-daily basis. From obviously the roadblocks, which were among the first ones, but now you have different ones, like occupation of ministries, protesting in front of the Electricité du Liban. Mm-hmm. Now we have I think there's something like 8 kilometers away from Baabda Palace, because they closed off the roads and so on.
And I want to just maybe pick your brain here. Last night was a tumultuous night. We had the president, whether intentionally or not, seemed to rebuff the demonstrations, and people took it as a direct insult. And it almost reinvigorated the protests, at least on the street. It seemed like it brought back a lot of people that were gradually maybe declining, or it seemed like the numbers reached a peak again last night. And today there's an upswell. It feels like an upswell of emotion. And tragically last night there was the loss of one protester who died in Khalde.
Yes.
Do you think that this movement or this revolution, and maybe the words don't matter as much, but this uprising, this proper euphoria that we're seeing, do you think there's a tipping point now that we can't go back from? In other words, do you think that whether the president stays or not, it's almost a fait accompli that his reign is over?
Yes. The optimist in me would say yes. I am a bit hesitant to just fully say yes, because these warlords, former warlords or current warlords, they have their own resources as well. And I don't think we've necessarily seen all of them yet. Mm-hmm. That being said, there is definitely something that has already been changed. There's this aura of respectability, of untouchability, mm-hmm. that has been broken. We've seen this through the direct insults, obviously, on the chants that protesters have addressed towards these politicians. Mm-hmm. But we're also seeing from their own actions, the disconnect between what Aoun said yesterday evening, and even adding insult to injury and saying things essentially like take it or leave it to protesters.
Yeah.
Felt, like the let them eat cakes moment. He really is utterly disconnected from reality. We don't even know how much he is actually shown footage of what people are saying, I don't know how much he actually knows, and that is the fact that it's a very legitimate question is in itself scary.
It's sort of taken for granted now that these are pre-taped and perhaps highly edited interviews. It almost seems like he himself is unable to completely express his feelings as well. He seems caught off guard and perhaps ill-equipped to be the
You had two journalists who were pre-chosen, two men in their I think 50s, and I think Jabran Basil, also his son-in-law and foreign minister, was in the room, and that's about it. And that's what they called an interview. And it's very revealing, it's very revealing that that's what they would consider an interview, because at the end of the day, these politicians don't like questions. They don't like actual journalism, actual investigations, critical questions. That's not really their thing. On literally has a whole TV channel for himself, OTV, where obviously criticism of the president is, let's put it mildly, discouraged.
Yeah.
That's how they're used to it. They're used to being praised. They're used to having their way. They're used to being called Fakhamat al-Rais or whatever, Your Excellency and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And they're just used to it. That's their world. And On especially, that's been his world since what? Like, he's been in the army since the 50s. Sorry.
Yeah.
His history in the Civil War, and then when he returned from exile in 2005, and so on, and then the whole joke at the time that he will definitely become president because that's the only thing he ever cared about, and then he did become president, obviously.
Yeah.
This is their world. This is the world they live in. They live in a world that has nothing to do with reality at this point.
Now, this maybe opens the door to another question, which is kind of how I know you. And we briefly emailed a few years ago, and I saw that you were running a blog and a podcast called Hummus for Thought, which I know is not solely focused on Lebanon, and I know it's not particularly political, although it does cover that terrain. But I noticed that there was a recent episode on covering what's happening. And I wanted to ask you the role of this type of media, whether it's audio narration or whether it's citizen journalism. I spoke to Jean Assir recently. He works for Megaphone News.
Yeah.
And I've spoken to sort of the younger generation that is, in a sense, taking media into their own hands. Do you think that is fundamental to the story? That what we're seeing now, the role of traditional outlets, at least in Lebanon, do you see that media is, in a sense, beyond their control as well? That they're not able to narrate or they're not able to spin because they're not part of the conversation? And I mean literally, they're not part of the conversation.
Yes, that's a very, very big difference now. I mean, social media is, it's become a cliche at this point, but it is really changing the rules of the game. Megaphone is a particularly good example because they're really doing an excellent job. And you have something called the Murasila, which is going to come out at some point, which is also promising to basically deliver this kind of in-depth journalism that is so lacking in the traditional media. You do have good journalists within bigger media outlets that are not necessarily the same as, let's say, the editor-in-chief. They do exist.
Mm-hmm.
There have been Ahmed al-Fali recently because they have resigned. Some journalists at Al-Akhbar that were fairly decent.
Yes.
But that didn't change the editorial, the stance of the editorial team. And so you have those dynamics. It's not that no one who works in TV, in mainstream TV or in the mainstream news outlets is a decent person.
Mm-hmm.
But their priorities are not the same because that's not what they are hired to do most of the time. It's almost been left it's almost become the job of like comedians and satirists and online bloggers and other independent folks in general who have been really highlighting these issues.
Right.
So I agree that there is a very, very big part to play for these media outlets, and I think that the revolution or the uprising, whatever, in the past month, we're seeing this becoming even more present.
And I'm curious, how do you get your news? Do you simply go to Twitter and refresh the news feed? Is it like, what is your go-to source for what's happening?
I have a lot of folks that I kind of like a curated list of journalists and both mainstream and independents and so on that I follow, and that's mainly on Twitter.
Okay.
And I do sometimes, if there are protests and I cannot make them, I would basically turn on LBC or Al Jadid because they have these live coverages on the streets.
Yeah.
Not necessarily to agree with everything that is being said, but it's live coverage, so usually people get to say whatever they want to say, more or less.
I think I've run into the same situation as you, where my content is through my phone, and that's usually Twitter and at most Facebook. But when it comes to just watching it from home, I turn on the TV, and it's for those split screens. These 8 shots at a time.
Exactly. It's really that the split screens, like, with all the criticism that can be rightfully made against some of Al Jadid and LBC's coverage, and there is some criticism that can be made. The split screen format, I think, has been really good, has been really excellent, because it just allows you to get a picture in a certain sense. You have, Tripoli up on the left, Nabati down on the left,
Exactly.
whatever, Beirut, whatever, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And they have this policy, essentially, of practice of, asking someone in Tripoli or some people in Tripoli for 10 minutes, and then they go to the bar for 10 minutes or whatever. And you can really see that you have these people who are not in the same place, obviously, but that are more or less saying the same thing. Sometimes you would have people who are sectarians, who are saying, that they are pro-Nasrallah, or they are pro-Jaja, or pro-whatever. They do exist. So it's not like they're being banned or anything like that. But it's interesting to see that the narrative isn't really being monopolized by these same actors anymore. And that's what's really interesting this time around.
It's almost like the news cycle is now determined via social media portals, and just the visual imagery is TV, as opposed to the other way around. No one...
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like the journalists on TV are not the ones dictating the story. It's the citizen journalists on the ground that are kind of doing it themselves.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't know if maybe that's too optimistic of me, but I would agree that at least there's a much, much greater role by these, whether citizen journalists, I'm not technically a journalist, I'm just a writer, bloggers, writers, just observers, people who are just documenting,
Mm-hmm.
There has been a significant majority of the footage that I have used to inspire myself when I'm writing have come from just random people uploading the footage on social media, on Twitter.
Right.
Because whether out of policy or just even in practice, the main journalism outlets cannot really send everyone everywhere.
Yeah.
So you have people doing it themselves, really, and they have been really doing an excellent job. I really think that without these social media coverages, if you want, you wouldn't have had the impact that you've had so far. I really don't think that this would have happened.
I agree. And, it's something relevant to the youth bulge that we see on the streets, that it's hard to tell what the average age is. I mean, you have all generations participating, but there's definitely a youth factor. And it almost seems like because this group, this segment of society is so advanced when it comes to technology, that it's almost like the ball is completely in their court at times. I was having a conversation about the chants being used, oftentimes these melodic insults to someone's mother that we all became accustomed to. And it could not be the older generation that creates that kind of music or melody. That's the youth. And there's in a sense, an insensitivity towards slurs. And I almost think that for a moment, everyone is okay with it. That, in other words, the grandparents are okay with their grandchildren cussing and going to the streets and protesting. And that is very unusual. This sort of willingness to participate and contribute to protests. And I don't know if you feel the same way when it comes to this sort of the usual... Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, sorry, I definitely do. My own grandparents are usually extremely hesitant. They're still hesitant, but there's definitely... what they're seeing on television is breaking their own expectations of what Lebanon can or should be.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that... I would credit millennials. I'm a millennial, and there's definitely a lot of millennials doing things, but I would especially credit the next generation, Generation Z as they're called, because they are really living in a world where, I don't want to overplay this, of course there are differences in classes and whatever, but generally speaking, they're living in a world where information is being spread so quickly to the point where it's almost impossible to filter. And you have the risks that come alongside this as well, obviously, fake news and so on. But the traditional mantles of power, the traditional's way of doing things, does not have a language on social media. Doesn't have their own word. They cannot really create memes in the same way. Their chants are very boring. They're so uncreative. They don't know how to do the same chants and the same signs. And there is a humor that is being used almost like a weapon on the streets, and it's so powerful because you can't really argue against humor. It's just funny, and so you can say that you don't want to laugh about Gibran Bassil if you're pro Gibran Bassil, but it will be very difficult for you not to laugh if this joke is against someone else. And so it creates this sort of a world where only like you can only isolate yourself from this humor that I'm calling basically like weapon type of humor by turning everything off. That's the only way you can do it, and no one does that.
Yeah, it almost seems like that is an impossible situation right now to literally switch it off. I think I think it is impossible to disconnect from what's happening. Even the least politically minded person is involved to a degree.
Even folks who were around Gibran Bassil himself started chanting the Hela Hela Ho song, and they just changed the lyrics to glorify Gibran Bassil.
Right.
Like I don't think they understand the irony behind it, because they have already given us this victory that we have made this chant so popular that even they had to adopt it.
Absolutely.
And the Hezbollah folks, they had this chant of, because we were chanting Killon Yani Killon, all of them means all of them. They had this chant of Mish Killon Abadan Mish Killon, like not everyone, obviously, like not everyone, whatever. And it's just not as catchy. It's just so boring. It makes no sense to chant. Why would you chant something like this? And it just defeats the purpose. They try to co-opt things, and it's not working. It's simply not working.
So much for producing your own talent, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to maybe get your perspective on a sort of tangential issue, and I know that you're doing your PhD in Europe, and in Europe now the big thing is not Lebanon, it's the Berlin Wall, the celebration of 30 years since the Berlin Wall fell. And I've asked this question on several episodes so far, but I think I want to ask you in particular because you're able to see both, and I wanted to maybe know that when you're in Europe and you're watching people sort of relive that 30-year mark, relive unification, relive the end of the Cold War, and in a sense coming out of a coma, which was a decades-long rift in the European continent, do you feel like a same moment is happening on a much, much smaller scale? That Lebanon is re-emerging from its coma?
Yeah, I guess we can make that argument, and because there's this expression, like the barrier of fear has been broken, and people have been using this. I think I heard this literally on the first night when people were protesting, like within the second hour or something. I saw it on some video on Twitter. Someone said it while he was in Beirut, I think, or something. So I guess we can make that argument. I'm not a big fan of just making comparisons because there's always different things and different factors and so on.
Sure.
But on a symbolic level, if you want, there's definitely something that has changed, and the question is really how will we continue? How will we maintain the momentum, and how will that energy be redirected? Will it always be on the streets? Will it be a combination of street stuff and maybe civil campaign stuff? Will it be I don't have the answer to that. And then the other question is, how will the quote-unquote establishment, and these days it especially means how will Michel Aoun and Nabi Berri and Nasrallah and Hariri to a certain extent, how will they react? What are their next steps? Then when they take their next steps, how will the protesters react to those steps? So yesterday, Michel Aoun's speech infuriated a lot of people, and then he had people take to the streets again, to the point where it's almost become a joke. Like I think, I forgot who said it, but many people have said this, that if politicians just learn to shut up and not say anything, the protest momentum might fizzle out on its own because people are exhausted, they have work to go, they have worries and concerns.
Yeah.
But they love talk, and they are going on television every day or two. What was it, yesterday or 2 days ago? There was like 5 different one of them who spoke on the same day. it's incredible, really. It's something that we haven't seen before, and it shows that something as simple as simply disrupting life as we know it in Lebanon, the economy, the roads, and so on, is scaring them so much, or is at least annoying them enough that they are willing to talk as much.
Now, this actually brings me to the final point, and I wanted to see your perspective here. That it's been 28 days. We're hitting the 1 month mark, and just I know the comparison is not fully representative, but the Berlin Wall began breaking down the first night, and it almost seemed at that moment that it was over. The revolution had happened, and there was a new chapter being sort of ushered in. There was no going back. And I know Lebanon operates on its own timeline. I know things take time here. Everything takes longer than it should. And I just wondering, in terms of testing the patience of the average person who has seen their economic fortunes decline, and the banks I think are indefinitely closed. It's an open-ended strike. Do you sense that time is a factor here? That if you don't have tangible results soon enough, that the momentum will it'll naturally fizzle out, that people will not be able to keep this and not sustain it. Is there any concern on that end?
Yes, very much so. I mean, the politicians are playing a waiting game.
Mm-hmm.
We know that it's extremely obvious. You don't need to have a degree in political science to see this.
Mm-hmm.
So there is always that risk. What I think will not happen is that the momentum will die out. I think what can happen, what has been happening in the past 28 days, is it goes up and down. And that's what we've been seeing, really.
Yeah.
Roadblocks are mainly an instrument of anger, especially like where you want to really disrupt things extremely quickly. That's the method that you use.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not something that protesters are using for a long period of time. It's not like for a week, for example.
Right.
Because there are, other people, service drivers, bus drivers, people need to go to school, whatever, that are especially affected by this, and it's not fair on them.
Yeah.
That being said, the worse things get, the more desperate people will get. So there are so many different risks, so many different fears of where this can go. My biggest fear has always been that the sectarian warlords will play this, and the only way they have always played this, which is, pit sects against one another. The good news is that up until now, this really hasn't worked. It really hasn't worked. Even yesterday, Hala, the man who was shot, belonged to the Druze community, and within like an hour, you had people in Beirut, people in Saida, people in Trablus, Tripoli, churches in Zahle were ringing their bells.
Yes.
There is something that is being done that is done in an extremely conscious way.
Yeah.
And I have difficulty seeing how you can undo this.
Yeah.
Like, really, the only way is like the worst possible way, which is like brute force and violence and everything. But for various reasons, and I'm sure, as you know, it's not as easy to do this in Lebanon because the state doesn't really have a monopoly on power in the first place.
Right. And I woke up this morning to a beautiful mural in Tripoli of Ale. I mean, it was just drawn within hours on a giant wall. And it's absolutely special that the country is in this together. And I think looking back years from now, we're going to remember these moments the most. Whether it's the split screen of everyone protesting together, or whether it's these symbolic gestures, all communities sort of reaching out to one another. I think these are going to be the moments that we take with us. Joey, just a final point. What would you like to see in terms of political effect? The protester on the street, if they want to be part of the equation, if they want to translate this energy into political gains and power, what would you recommend for the protesters to do in order for this not to die out, in order for this to be sustainable, and actually, in a way, confront the political class politically?
I think when the time comes and we have elections, there has to be two things that happen. And I'm not saying this as, a disconnected, self-appointed expert or whatever. This is something that we hear on the streets anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that we need to have a proper election law, one that does not depend on a sectarian quota as it has been so far.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is that we will have to have very good independent candidates providing a progressive platform that people can rally around.
Yeah.
So there are things that on the streets we hear are grievances that are very common. The injustices related to economic grievances are a big one. The fact that women still cannot pass on the nationality, that's a very big one. And so on and so forth. There will have to be candidates willing to place themselves forward, who are able to argue very convincingly. I personally think that that's going to happen. I think Beirut Madinati in 2016 was an example of that. It had its limitations, definitely, but I don't think we will ever find something that will not have its limitations. But what the next steps will be, that's what's difficult. I think that this is what the next steps should be, but that's not to say that even if this, I'm saying that this is what the next steps should be, I'm not saying that the momentum on the streets should ever fizzle out. For example, one thing that I think should never change is the politics of reclaiming space that we're seeing right now, especially in downtown Beirut.
Yes.
I think this is something that is very powerful in itself, and it has the potential to create public spaces in a country, and especially in Beirut, which saw a lot of the privatization, especially in Lebanon, where we don't really have this concept of public space. If we're managing to create this, that in itself for me will be a significant, if even maybe fatal blow to sectarianism, because in the public you don't have sects. In the public, nothing is owned by any sect or any warlord. By definition, it belongs to everyone. Yeah. And if we manage to get this, that for me would be a really, really significant victory.
I'm old enough. I'm hitting 40 soon. I'm old enough to have been inside the egg when it was still being used regularly, and this is post-war. The cinema became almost like an art space at times, and people at times partied there. So I do have memories of the egg, but for me, the really enchanting moment was walking to the Grand Theater, which I had never seen.
Yes.
And people, did you manage to get in?
I did, yeah. A couple of weeks ago.
So this to me was priceless, because that is really, we all know it's there. We've all been there thousands of times, just never got the chance to go inside. And it was almost like walking in a way to a locked up part of the city that we broke free. And I think that is a very special moment. People reclaimed what is theirs, and very peacefully. Unfortunately, one protester died, slipped and fell, but otherwise it was really magical moment to have unlocked this space. And I really was taken aback by that moment. Joey, I want to thank you for your time. I know that the roads are a bit tricky today, and we're doing this on Skype, even though we're both in Beirut. But I really appreciate your time and your thoughts on what's happening.
My pleasure, honestly. Thank you.
Daily episodes as the uprising continues. To stay up to date, subscribe to your preferred podcast platform or find us on our YouTube channel. And kindly consider a contribution through Patreon in the details box below. Until next time, I'm Rani Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.